Amanda joined the Center for Watershed Protection as a water resources engineer in 2022. Prior to joining the center, she was in consulting engineering for 16 years and municipal engineering at the city of Salisbury, Maryland for 10 years. Amanda has experience in project management, grant writing and administration, water, wastewater, stormwater design, and construction administration. She managed Salisbury's MS4 program and implemented the stormwater utility. Amanda holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in civil engineering from Lehigh University and is a licensed professional engineer. And now I'm going to turn it over to you, Amanda.
Hey, thank you so much, Lee, and welcome everyone. I'm so happy to have you here today. So today we're going to talk about stormwater funding and financing. We're going to generally cover the topics of general funds, enterprise funds, grants and bonds, loans and state revolving funds, as well as public-private partnerships. So today we're really looking to balance debt versus revenue and figure out how to fund your projects. So before we get too far into it, I want to do a really quick poll just to see where you're coming from. So Lee, if you don't mind launching that poll. And this is really going to tell us which of these stormwater funding mechanisms you've used before. So tell me what you're the most familiar with, or if you've used everything, go ahead and say all of the above. But I'd like to hear where you're coming from before we get started. So I'll just give everyone a second. It looks like a lot of people have grant experience. Okay, we're about halfway there, a little bit over. I'll give it just another minute. Nobody has said all of the above yet, so that's interesting. Hopefully coming out of today, you'll have some knowledge about everything. So it looks like the bulk of the participants, about 78%, have used grant funding. A fair amount of people, about half, have used general funds, much less on the enterprise fund, only about 4%, one person, and then a little bit less on the other mechanisms as well. So that's great. I'm glad to know. Hopefully this will be very educational for you. Okay, so we're going to start with general funds. I'm not going to spend much time on general funds. A lot of you were familiar, but general funds are sort of that catch-all term. General funds are typically tax revenue that can be used for any municipal need. So I found from my history as working in a municipality, it's a really difficult way to fund stormwater projects because you're competing with all the other interests that are going on in the municipality, such as public safety, roads, sanitation, anything else that's not covered by an enterprise fund is covered by the general fund. Also, typically in a municipal budget, general funds are a use it or lose it type proposition where you have the fiscal year to spend that money from tax revenue. So it's a delicate balancing act. But in general, general funds or tax revenues could be used for operations, for employee salaries, for maintenance of a stormwater system. They could also be used for projects, and then they would be used for emergencies. So that's also a tricky thing. I know one of the years I was at Salisbury, we had a really large flooding emergency in the first month of the fiscal year, and it ate up my entire stormwater budget for the year that came from general funds. So it's always hard to balance when you only have one revenue source to cover operations, maintenance, and emergencies. So that is general funds. Next, we'll talk about enterprise funds, which include stormwater utilities. So enterprise funds are essentially any type of funding that's dedicated to be intended to be used for only one source. So for an authority or a utility to manage and oversee a specific type of use. So today we're going to be talking about stormwater utilities, and stormwater utilities are an enterprise fund. And Will Williams will talk a lot more in the case study about Westchester's stormwater utility. But essentially, depending on how you set up your stormwater utility, it could be used for the operation and maintenance of your existing storm drain system. Could be used for designing and constructing different types of projects that improve water quality. And even in some situations, it could be used for citywide street sweeping or other things that may contribute to meeting your MS4 permit, or different practices that remove sediment and trash from entering storm drains. Another thing stormwater utilities could be used for is creating small grant programs to help HOAs or nonprofits or small community groups do projects in your community. So it all depends on how you define the uses for your stormwater utility and whatever ordinance that is used by your municipality to establish it. But the nice thing about it is dedicated for a specific use. So the funds can't be transferred to, say, public safety or roads or something like that. So some of the benefits, as I said, it is a dedicated revenue source. And I always found that to be particularly useful because it was targeted for stormwater. So it gave me a dedicated pot of money that couldn't be touched by other groups. It also is able to help advance your clean water goals. So that's really something to promote if you're trying to create a stormwater utility, is helping to achieve whatever clean water goals you're looking at, to say, you know, this is helping to clean up the Delaware River or the Delaware Bay, or even just minor tributaries, but something that people can relate to. There's also a nice benefit if you can create a credit program, which encourage property owners to do more themselves. And then they really feel invested in the stormwater utility. People generally don't like a new fee or a tax. So if you can give them some opportunity to do things on their own property, and then they can either reduce their bill or potentially even eliminate their bill, knowing that they've already contributed to clean water goals. A huge benefit of stormwater utilities is oftentimes those funds can be used as matches when you apply for other grants. A lot of grant programs encourage matches, and so a stormwater utility is a perfect way to have funding set aside for a match. So some of the challenges of establishing a stormwater utility, first and foremost, was effective public outreach. And I know in the chat at the beginning, someone had mentioned, how do you get buy-in from elected officials? And I think that's one of the most important things on trying to establish a stormwater utility, is really explaining why it's necessary. And if you have any examples of what your general revenue is, or however you typically pay for stormwater projects, and then show what a stormwater utility could bring in as far as revenue and what you could do if you had that revenue, that's a good way to explain to the elected officials is, you know, right now it's a very small percent and I utilize most of it just on operations, just cleaning out inlets and storm drains. And I rarely have enough money to do XYZ projects that I would like to do. But really trying to get that buy-in from elected officials is critical to get them on board, while you're then trying to convince citizens and other organizations. From my experience, when we were trying to adopt the stormwater utility in Salisbury, we went and had specific meetings with the Chamber of Commerce and talked to them about the impact for businesses, and really tried to address a lot of those questions outside of just city council meetings. You know, we do a lot of one-on-one outreach to larger businesses. The Board of Education was a large potential customer. So really, again, just outreaching to get everyone on board. One of the really important things is managing expectations. So I put there in parentheses, no more flooding. I think we can all agree that having a stormwater utility is not going to guarantee that there's never going to be flooding. So flooding will still occur. And it's really important to make sure people understand that just because they're paying a fee doesn't mean that there's never going to be flooding anymore, and making sure that their expectations are in line. Now, hopefully that fee will help pay for projects that reduce flooding. And that can be some of the goals of establishing the utility, but making sure that people understand it's not going to be perfect on day one, and it's probably not going to be perfect even in 5 or 10 years, because you know, you can't always anticipate flooding events. Also, sometimes flooding is caused by things outside of our control, a clogged pipe or just an extreme storm event. So Again, setting very clear expectations as to what it means to have a stormwater utility and what those funds will be used for. Okay, how to invoice is a huge, huge challenge and something that seems to be hotly debated. And I know will talk about, some of this a little bit later. For me, when we established a stormwater utility, we had to look at the how to invoice as well as the consequences for non-payment. And it was important for Salisbury's council that even though we were considering it a utility instead of a tax, a utility fee, that it was not billed on their water and sewer utility bill, because the consequence for non-payment of a utility bill was that your water could get cut off. And they didn't want, the city council did not want anyone to lose the ability to have drinking water if they couldn't pay the stormwater component on their utility bill. So again, this took a lot of discussion and going back and forth. So some places decide to bill this as a completely separate bill. So then it's not on your tax bill, it's not on your utility bill, it's a separate stormwater bill. But it really comes down to each jurisdiction, what invoices you have control over. Maybe you don't do the tax billing, maybe you do. Is it easy to add another line item or not? Do you want it a part of the tax bill if you're saying it's not a tax, but it's a utility fee? So this alone, there's a lot of different possibilities here, but understanding the ramifications of how you invoice it and the consequences for non-payment is really important. The next piece was, how do you handle tax exempt properties? So again, if it's a utility and you're viewing this just like water and sewer, then everyone should pay this fee because everyone contributes stormwater into your municipal system. So typically, tax exempt properties are sent a stormwater utility bill, just like they would pay for water and sewer. So that took special outreach for those tax exempt properties to make sure that they understood what this was, especially again, referring to Salisbury's example, where we were not adding this to their utility bill. Salisbury ended up putting it on the tax bill. So we then had religious organizations, for example, that were receiving a tax bill for the first time with one line item on it for stormwater. So that took a lot of outreach. And even though we did a lot of outreach in advance, it took a lot of explaining when that first round of bills came out. So making sure that your staff that's answering the phone, whether it's in the Public Works Department or the Finance Department, really everyone needs to be on board and understand why it was done that way and be able to communicate it. And again, your elected officials, just the same. This is critical for them to understand why it's done that way so that they too can explain it when they get stopped by their constituents. Finally, one of the challenges is affordability. Of course, if you are establishing a stormwater utility, you want it to be affordable for your residents. This shouldn't create a hardship. However, I strongly recommend having a hardship waiver process so that if it is creating a burden on someone that you did not anticipate, they have the ability to apply to have this fee waived. So we did have that in Salisbury. There was a very small number, really just a couple of properties that applied every year, but we certainly gave consideration for that. Also, in the discussion of affordability, I recommend that you start small. You may think that ultimately, you need, I'm just going to throw out a number, you need $100,000 in revenue every year to be able to achieve a project that you've got a few years down the road. You may want to either start small and ramp up slowly, or depending on what you think your council's ability is to raise rates every year, you may just want to start at the rate that you hope to be at in 5 years. But you should have some plan, some type of a capital improvement plan that would show, here's why we have set these rates. But strongly recommend it to be affordable as well so that people can understand and get on board. So one of the key things with having a stormwater utility is figuring out how to have a measurable unit so that you can invoice your property owners. So one way to do that, there are a number of different ways to do that, but one way is to have a fee that's based on some dollar amount per single family house, or an ERU, an equivalent residential unit. So then you would calculate using aerials typically the impervious area for anything that's not a single family house, a commercial or an industrial property, or multifamily residential like an apartment complex. And you would determine the impervious area in square feet, and then you would apply a typical ERU impervious area from a single family using some representative sampling of single family homes to determine the number of ERUs that a commercial or industrial property would have. So again, we didn't necessarily look at every single family to come up with that ERU rate, but you could look at certain neighborhoods and just try to, get an idea. How many single family do you have? What's the typical impervious area per single family, and establish an ERU rate. And that will probably either be in the ordinance that establishes your stormwater utility, or that's something that you could update annually with your fee schedule. And then from there, use that to determine the impervious area of different properties where you would be billing them above 1 ERU. Another thing, a lot of folks set 1 ERU as the minimum. So say you have a property that comes in under that, you may still want to bill them as 1 ERU. And that kind of comes down to how you would look at vacant properties. Some people say that vacant properties maybe are not contributing stormwater runoff if it's a natural or just a grass or compacted cover, so they could get 0 bill. Or you could look at it and say, everybody gets 1 ERU. Everyone is going to pay the rate as a single family. So there's some decisions like that. Another way to look at it is to do the fee based on the percentage of impervious area, with there being a higher rate if it's a very developed parcel with a higher percentage of impervious, and a lower rate if it's a vacant property or light development. Again, in that scenario, if you have 0 impervious, maybe you get no bill. So a couple different ways to look at how to measure the units to build stormwater utilities off of. So either way, you will have to create some type of mapping tool that shows impervious surfaces. Again, I recommend using aerial imagery, but trying to figure out how to update that regularly. And it sort of depends again on your budget and your ability to get aerial imagery. There are going to be some parcels that have developed and are completely different. So you could, if you're looking at annual updates, prioritize those parcels higher and say, okay, this was vacant and now it's a 50 unit subdivision. So I know we need to calculate impervious area here, or not a single family, but an apartment complex. Or you can look at the entire town every year, every 2 or 3 years, kind of depending on when things are updating. So trying to update it regularly, because again, if you don't update it and new impervious has come out, then you're not billing accurately. I mean, the whole idea is to try to make sure that you're billing at the right amount. So one thing that we did in Salisbury was created these impervious surface exhibits, because sometimes the fee is going to be challenged by a property owner, and they should have the right to be able to see what your assumptions were. So property owners could appeal a fee if there's some type of an error, like an incorrect property line, maybe an incorrect property owner even, or a math error. Or if they look at your impervious surface exhibit and there's something that you thought was impervious, but they can prove otherwise, that type of thing could also be looked at. So, I recommend whatever tools you're using for your aerial imagery, make sure it's something then that staff could follow up with and be able to kind of create an exhibit or some type of way that property owners could go in and look at it themselves and understand what on their property is impervious. This also plays back to having a credit program. So if people see what they're being billed on, then they can understand more based on your credit program, what they could do to lessen your bill. If they have a large parking lot with no stormwater management at all, they're just paying the flat impervious rate. Or could they apply for a credit if they put in certain stormwater management, best management practices, and apply for a credit for those? So again, something to consider with your credit program. Okay, so next we're going to talk a little bit about grants. Now, I know most of the folks on the call were from Pennsylvania and New Jersey, but this is a multi-jurisdictional webinar, we're not going to focus on many of the types of grants, but more just how to utilize grant funding. But because there are a number of you here, and I've listed a couple of examples of types of grants, if you'd like to put in the chat your favorite grant to use, or your go-to grant, or what you really like to use for stormwater projects, I think that would be a great way to share with your peers and give them some ideas of maybe some grant funding mechanisms they weren't familiar with. But as far as grants, I wanted to cover some of the keys to successful grant funding. So first and foremost, I recommend that you really maintain a schedule for funding cycles. A lot of the grants are cyclical, and you see an email or you see an RFP pop up for grant funding and you think, oh gosh, okay, this is due in 6 weeks. How can I get this together? Do I have the right partners, this and that? But if you can really map this out and know that it's coming every March, there's going to be an application for whatever. So then you can plan ahead. And so that's one of the keys, is planning for applications and then also planning for the reporting due dates. So set up a calendar. If there are multiple people in your offices deal with this, share calendar appointments or share reminders, but try to really put it on your calendar and map it out. Also prioritize projects from your adopted plans. I think that's important for a lot of the funding agencies to see that there's a reason that you're asking for this money. This is part of our hazard mitigation plan, or this is part of a nuisance flooding plan or our capital improvement plan. Show them why it's important. Maybe a watershed management plan has recommended a number of different projects and they need to be done in a certain order. Also, it's critical to understand the various components of the project that the grant will fund. So not all grants fund design, not all grants fund construction, some fund everything. So really understanding each grant program individually and understanding what components they will fund before you apply. It'll give you a higher chance of success at getting that grant. Also, try to meet or exceed the match requirements. And I mentioned earlier, if you have a stormwater utility, that's a great way to provide match funding. Also, a lot of grant programs allow in-kind match, where you can show that staff is doing some work and the equivalent amount of time that their hours is could be used for grant match. You want to try to leverage grants with other funding opportunities. So sometimes you can apply for multiple grants, or maybe even a loan or a bond in coordination with grant, again, just to try to get the best package to fund a particular project. Certainly you want to utilize and highlight partnerships. So this may be partnerships with other municipalities for a regional type project, or partnerships with watershed groups or NGOs to, again, try to show support for a project, different components being done by different partners, like outreach by some groups and different pieces from the municipality. And then finally, make sure you understand the grant administration and reporting needs before you submit for a grant, and that it is something that you or your staff will be able to handle, because you certainly need to be successful in administration and reporting to set yourself up to get another grant. So if a grant agency is struggling with having to remind you to submit your report, or information is not complete, you run the risk of not being reimbursed from your grant, but then you also run the risk that you may not receive a grant from them again in the future. So these are some of the keys to being successful with funding your projects through grants. Okay, so next we'll talk briefly about bonds. So bonds are typically reserved for some of your larger stormwater projects, because it is a slightly more cumbersome process to go through, where a local government would issue and secure bonds. Investors in bonds receive tax-exempt payments, interest payments, for the life of that bond, and then they receive their principal back at the end. And typically a bond term is about 30 years. So there are two main types of bonds. General obligation bonds, or GOB, is backed by the full faith and credit of the issuer. General obligation bonds are typically municipal type bonds where the revenue is taxes. So this goes back to our general fund type projects. The other type of bond common for stormwater projects is a revenue bond. And that's backed by revenues from some type of an enterprise, which could be a stormwater utility. So again, this is a longer process going on the bond market, typically reserved for your larger type projects. So next we'll touch on loans and state revolving funds. So the two main types of loans are private banking versus SRF or state revolving fund. Some of the key differences being, of course, how to apply for those. It's very, very different. The terms and the duration and the interest rates. So I'm not going to cover private banking loans here because that's more common and it's very unique to what institutions, banking institutions you'd be meeting with. So we're going to talk a little bit about state revolving funds. So state revolving funds have been around for many decades, and it's a partnership through the federal government to have states administer federal funds. There's two main types of SRFs. There's the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, which was established back in 1987 as an amendment to the Clean Water Act. And then there are the Drinking Water State Revolving Funds, which were established in 1996 as an amendment to the Safe Drinking Water Act. So today, because we're talking about stormwater funding, we'll be highlighting the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. So each state administers their SRFs a little bit differently, and the federal government does give them the ability to do so. So states can set their own priority ranking systems. So again, we have a couple different jurisdictions here, but you would look at your state's SRF program to understand what are the key components of a project that would give me enough ranking points to rank highly enough to get funded. The states rank and fund projects in priority order based on an intended use plan. So after applications are received and reviewed, each state would issue an intended use plan that shows that ranking, as well as how much funding is available and sort of a funding line. So one of the benefits of SRFs is it's typically low interest loans, which are below the market rate, and there can be flexible repayment terms. Typically, SRFs do not require a match from the applicant, but they can be used as match for other federal grants. So this is a nice type program to be able to couple with other programs, such as we mentioned before, trying to couple with other grant programs. So the Clean Water SRF covers stormwater and wastewater. So as far as stormwater projects goes, it could be any sort of best management practices, potentially, whether it's ag or forest, green infrastructure projects, riparian buffers, stream restoration. You know, you'll want to look at your specific state SRF to see, again, how the different projects would rank, and are the rankings based on nutrient load reduction or cost effectiveness per pound of nutrient removed, or what are the different parameters to make sure that you're trying to optimize your application and rank as highly as possible. Typically, SRFs are eligible for the borrowers to be from local governments, utilities, potentially conservation districts, nonprofits, watershed groups, or community groups. So eligible costs may include sampling, planning, design, construction, some equipment purchases, as well as potentially land acquisition for the project. Typically, ineligible costs include long-term routine monitoring, operation and maintenance, and then fines and penalties. So an SRF, and especially where it is basically a loan program, even though there is some loan principal forgiveness, it's really not intended for your routine operation, maintenance, and monitoring type costs. So it's not that type of a program, but it is great for planning, designing, and constructing large stormwater projects. Okay, so I'm assuming you all have been familiar with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Infrastructure Investments and Job Act. So the act was signed in November of 2021 and has provided historic funding levels across all the SRFs over a 5-year period. So there was over $50 billion for water infrastructure, including drinking water and clean water across the country. So it's significant. In the clean water SRFs alone, there was about $12.7 billion put in across the country. And you can see how that's broken down. Most of that went into general supplemental clean water SRF above and beyond what the federal government would have put into the SRF for the various states. And then there was $1 billion for emerging contaminants funding. So we have a nice opportunity right now. We're still in the early years of this to try to get projects together to apply for Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So again, this money went to the state's SRFs. So some of the positives with that is that it does include some flexible financing and funding mechanisms, such as loans and grants. The SRF program doesn't usually say that it's grant funding. The way it is described as loan principal forgiveness. So you can apply for a loan or potentially a loan principal forgiveness, which would be effectively a grant. The way the bipartisan infrastructure law or bill was set up is it did require that emerging contaminant funding be provided as 100% grant or fully forgivable loans. It also required that 49% of the clean water SRF needed to go to communities meeting certain affordability criteria and to green projects. So that's also a benefit for meeting your stormwater goals. So disadvantaged communities play a big role in the SRF funding. Each state has the ability to establish the disadvantaged communities criteria. So it varies slightly state by state. But bill did require that there would be additional subsidies or grants for both urban and rural disadvantaged communities, as well as some loan forgiveness. In general, disadvantaged communities get lower interest rates and potentially longer terms on the loan portion of their financing. So bill has tried to address some of the inequitable and inadequate water infrastructure with a focus towards disadvantaged communities. So they put a lot of effort into the law to make sure that there were specific subsidies going for disadvantaged communities, which is a positive. That's not always been a criteria for SRFs that a certain percentage has to go to disadvantaged communities. So again, it's a very good opportunity to look at certain areas and see if you can apply or you fit under the eligibility criteria of a disadvantaged community. So one of the things I did want to discuss with SRF funding is administration, because they are kind of slightly cumbersome programs, or you may hear that criticism sometime. It's not necessarily the easiest program. It's oftentimes a little bit more challenging to administer than grant funding. So the bipartisan infrastructure law allows for 2% administrative fees. That's called a technical assistance reserve. So if you end up utilizing an outside consultant, you could utilize 2% of what you're receiving for your SRF money to pay for them to help administer. Or if you are doing it yourself through the municipality, again, 2% of the money can go back to you, whether that's to hire someone else or to supplement someone's salary who is doing the administration. So you've probably heard, if you recall, American Iron and Steel. In the bill, it's called Build America, Buy America. So this covers iron, steel, other manufactured products, and construction materials. So again, with an effort of having American-made products be at the front of this program. So with that comes reporting requirements on where all your products used in whatever the construction is, where they came from. So you'll have to make sure you're obtaining certifications from the manufacturers and submitting that information properly when you have this loan. Also, the SRF program and bill requires Davis-Bacon wage rates when you put construction out for bid. And with that comes a review of certified payroll to make sure that the contractor is paying his employees correctly based on the wage rates. So these are some slightly different administrative type processes. If you're not familiar with them, they just are very detail oriented. It just takes a lot of work. So again, it's slightly different. You would typically not have this type of thing with a typical loan that you would get from a private bank. Some grants may have wage rate requirements, but not all. So just make sure you fully understand what you're getting into with the SRF. I should say that SRF is more common for larger drinking water projects like water towers or water treatment plants, or wastewater projects like upgrading a wastewater treatment plant or adding in pump stations or sewer mains. And it's in more recent years becoming more popular for use for larger stormwater projects. So again, it's a lot of the same criteria. If you have used the SRF before for water and wastewater projects, it's very similar for stormwater. And again, stormwater does fall under the clean water SRF, just like wastewater projects do. Okay, the last funding or finance mechanism that I wanted to talk about was public-private partnerships. And a public-private partnership, or a P3, it's really kind of a financing strategy for a different type of project delivery. So a P3 is a partnership between some type of a governmental entity and the private sector. And it's a way to build public infrastructure or provide some type of a public service with a slightly different lens. So it doesn't necessarily follow your traditional procurement process, where a municipality may put out a bid for design and then bid a construction portion and receive permits and then do the maintenance yourself. This is kind of an alternative delivery method that allows the entire project to potentially get bundled together and to look for public sector entities, or I'm sorry, private sector entities that can do a turnkey project, that can do almost anything. So a municipality could put out a project and say, I want this to be a design build, or it could include operations and maintenance. There's a kind of a wide variety, but essentially you're turning a lot of the control of a project over to the private sector to try to fast track a project, or again, have it be turnkey, to put more of the burden of all the aspects of it onto the private sector and share in the risk and reward, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But essentially, the public sector will still own whatever the infrastructure is. So if you would like certain projects, green infrastructure projects, or you're trying to meet certain water quality goals, you could say, we would like some projects that reduce, X number of pounds of nitrogen, and put out a pay for performance type RFP. And the public sector, the public entity, would still own those projects when they're done. However, a private sector firm would come in and finance and manage the project. Ultimately, the goal is that this should create a faster and more cost-effective project delivery. And it's going to encourage innovation. Instead of saying, we want this exact green infrastructure built right here, you're kind of opening it up to more innovation and see what the private sector can come in with. So this is a chart that EPA has put out to kind of explain how a P3, how the relationships work. So again, the private developer would provide the initial capital and finance the project, but that doesn't mean the public's not ultimately paying for it. So the public entity still has to fund this project somehow, whether it be through general funds or enterprise funds, or even potentially an SRF. But it may be that instead of paying for a design contract and for a construction contract, you're paying at the end for pounds of a nutrient removed. So it can be structured very differently. The EPA studies have said that the P3 model can leverage a public investment with private equity at an estimated rate of 10-to-1, which is really impressive. $10 of private equity could go so far with a $1 of a public investment. So why does this work? The P3 model really shares risk and reward between the public and the private entities. So typically there's risk on any type of project. From a public entity, a municipality, you have certain regulatory requirements that you're following. You may have permit requirements that you're trying to meet. and you probably have fairly rigid procurement and financing mechanisms. So that kind of leaves you with less flexibility to be innovative. You have to follow certain procedures from your charter or your code. On the other side, a private entity, when they're bidding in that format, they're having to assume risk. If a contractor's putting in a bid based on a design, they're trying to anticipate where things may go wrong, and they're building risk into their bid. So it may result in a project being more expensive. Also, a lot of times the contractor wouldn't necessarily feel any sort of ownership with the project because they're just coming in at the tail end and building something. So their risk includes managing cost escalation, schedule and delays, and unforeseen things like that. Where in a P3, the risk is shared, and that provides for reward. So on the public side, the reward could include faster delivery. Again, hopefully you can package this such that a project could be done a lot quicker. You all know for some municipal projects where you have maybe rigid financing mechanisms, you may have to budget for design 1 year. You may not be able to budget for construction for 2 or 3 years. So it may take longer to actually achieve a project if you're budgeting over multiple fiscal years. Whereas in this model, if you're paying for the results, you're paying for performance based on a P3 model, you're budgeting at one time knowing, okay, we're targeting completion of this to be in 3 years, and that's when we're going to buy these nutrient credits or whatever at this certain rate. So again, it's a market-based approach. So it should provide a lower cost and innovative solution to your problem. And potentially the entity that's designing the project is also working with the entity that's constructing it and may very well be performing maintenance on that asset. So that's kind of the ideal circumstances, that maybe this is a long-term relationship where you're paying for the result, but then you'd be paying for that result ongoing. On the private side, there is reward also because it's leveraging private sector investment and increasing business opportunities. There are companies now that specialize in doing this type of work. So that's stimulating economic development. And then it's also providing that integrative approach. It maximizes efficiencies. It's looking at potentially larger economies of scale. Sometimes the P3 entity may actually be looking at doing more regional projects to again, maximize the efficiency of the project. So again, it's not that the public entity is getting this for free, but they're getting a very different type project at a different type pace than they would have under some of the other models. So this is a slightly different, the other funding mechanisms were more revenue and debt based. This one is more of a financing strategy, but I thought it would be important to share this today with the other models. So that covered all of our general financing and funding strategies, and we can certainly have time at the end to talk about those, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. But next, I wanted to introduce our guest speaker who's going to provide a case study. So Will Williams joined the Borough of Westchester as the organization's first sustainability director in 2019. He works on energy, environmental and stormwater initiatives, as well as capital planning and project execution. Prior to working for Westchester, Will worked in energy and water conservation, capital projects, energy procurement, and sustainable development as the director of sustainability and utility management for Philadelphia-based Penrose Properties, which is a multifamily mixed-use developer. Will also worked as an energy and sustainability coordinator at Liberty Property Trust, a commercial and industrial real estate investment trust. Will received his Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science from the University of Colorado in Boulder and is currently studying sustainable engineering at Villanova University. Will is a lead green associate and a certified building operator. He resides in the Westchester area with his wife, Marika, and a beagle mutt named Whiskey Boy. So thanks for being here, Will. I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Amanda. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about our fee. It's been in the news lately, which we'll get into, and received a lot of questions. And this is something we're all grappling with. So hopefully, what I have to say is of use to folks who've joined today. If you're not familiar with Westchester Borough, the borough is the county seat of Chester County. We're about half an hour west of Philadelphia. The borough itself is 1.8 square miles. I mentioned we're the county seat. We're also home to Westchester University. Number of schools, nonprofits, churches, things like that. Very dense downtown. Our population density for the entire borough is actually similar to Washington, D.C. or the city of Chicago, although we have lots of open space preserved as well. Our stormwater challenges are, not, I don't think unique to our town. I'm sure folks on the call are dealing with similar things. We have 3 to 5 severe events per year. I learned this year, or in 2022, I should say, that our stormwater issues are not volume related, they're rate related. What I mean by that is, I think it was Hurricane Ian sort of brushed the East Coast this fall. We had 4 days of rain. We got like 6 inches of rain over 4 days. Not a problem throughout the borough anywhere, no flooding whatsoever. It's the extreme direct hit hurricanes and those summertime downpours when you get an inch of rain in 25 minutes in, some steaming hot day in August when a cold front comes through. That's what we really struggle with. That's where our system really breaks down. Like every other community in the country and maybe the world, we have aging infrastructure. A lot of things have been in the ground 80, 100 years or more. We have actually 200-year-old stormwater infrastructure that we're dealing with now. We have 13 pipe streams. That's exactly what it sounds like, a stream that sometime in the past we thought we could contain in some sort of tunnel, some sort of infrastructure. Might have held up great for half a century or so, but we're dealing with a lot of those problems now. About 50% of our land is impervious. So as you can imagine, all that creates a lot of runoff, especially when high rates of precipitation pass through the area. According to DEP, we have 2 impaired waterways or watersheds, Goose Creek being one of them. That's where we get the worst flooding. So we have 2 PRP, pollution reduction plans, and total maximum daily load for one of our creeks for sediment. We have budget challenges. Again, not anything unique to the borough, but municipal government always seems to be looking under the couch cushions for quarters. But something that is very unique to us, I mentioned, we're the county seat. We have a huge footprint of municipally owned buildings for Chester County. We also have Westchester University. Those are tax exempt entities. This means 1/3 of the property in our town is not taxable. You can see where I'm going with this. And of course, increasingly complex regulatory environment over the last decade or so. All this translates to, we have a lot of stormwater related expenses and they are growing year by year. And we need something to address that. Here's some examples of flooding in our community on Goose Creek. This is what I call the Westchester University Swimming and Diving Club. This is during Hurricane Ida. Pretty scary stuff here. So I always say, our recommendation when you're swimming out there in floodwaters is go feet first and bring a flotation device.
Will, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we can't see your slide.
Uh-oh. At all?
No, we're seeing you still, which is fine, but,
Oh, gosh.
but I knew now you were presenting a picture, so I wanted to make sure we could see it.
Yeah, wow, my jokes are gonna really fall flat then, huh? How about that?
Not yet.
Wow.
You know what? Oh, here we go. Now it's, yes, there
Okay.
we go. We can see it now. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Let me go full screen here. You're still seeing that?
Yes. Yep. We
Okay.
can see it.
Yeah, so these are completely sober students swimming in our flooded streets and creek beds. Pretty scary stuff, and obviously a lot of need in our community for stormwater management. So this all led to the creation of our stream protection fee. About 10 years ago, a task force of our borough council was created to really dig into this issue. And the exercise was basically to annualize the long-term costs of both maintaining our existing system, building out the existing system to address some of these issues that we have, and also meet the sort of new regulations coming down the pipeline from DEP, including the PRP plans, TMDL, illicit discharge detection and elimination. So they did that exercise. Again, this is all 2013 dollars, which is going to get to something else I'll talk about later. They came up with this number. We need $1.4 million a year dedicated funding for stormwater management. Then it just became an exercise of solving for $1.4 million. They looked at the total impervious area at the property, came up with the rate that you see on the right here, $6.70 per 1,000 square feet of impervious surface per month. And that became the basis for our bill. The program was recommended for adoption at the tail end of 2013. So basically this task force took a year to digest the problem and proposed what they consider to be the most equitable way of generating that revenue. And then you'll see here, there was a gap of 3 years, 2013 to 2016. I wasn't here for that, but I think this is where, the politics came into perspective, and this is a difficult decision to make. I lived in the borough for 12 years, and my annual stream protection fee bill was about 25% of what my total, it was about 20% of my total financial burden to the borough. I think that's pretty typical. So in other words, we were looking at a 20%, I'll call it a fee, but tax fee increase for all property owners in the borough, including those that never paid any taxes. And I think it took 3 years for the elected officials to wrap their heads around the issue, the equity, to see the need, to look at other ways of funding this and decide, yes, this is the best way to go forward. It's going to be wildly unpopular, but it needs to be done. So 2017, we started billing. It's a separate bill, goes out every December by ordinance for the upcoming year. There's a 2% discount if you pay in January. You can pay quarterly, or you can pay the whole thing in full by March. We have about 4,400 parcels in the borough, all about, there's maybe 8 to 10 parcels that have no development whatsoever, just totally green space. They actually don't get a bill, but everyone else does. We looked into billing it along with the sewer bill because we own our sewer system and bill that monthly, but there was an imperfect correlation between properties and sewer accounts. Like a single property can have multiple sewer accounts. A property also doesn't need a sewer account, and making that system work versus just creating a new system. It seems like creating something new would have been easier and led to less confusion. There's an appeal and credit program. Appeal is, you've assessed my property too high. We need to bring down the rate to be accurate. We used to do that, go out to the property with a tape measure, measure up all the impervious surface. Now we do that with a program called NearMap. It's basically an extremely souped up version of Google Maps. We get high definition satellite imagery 4 times per year going back to 2015. And it's really, I can do an appeal in 2 minutes now, whereas it used to be an hour in the field. And it's also, we just draw a polygon around impervious surfaces defined in the ordinance, send it back to the homeowner, say, here's what we're looking at. You're either wrong, your appeal has been approved, or we're rejecting the appeal. Here's why. Let us know if you want to, if we got anything wrong from there, in which case we might go out to the property with a tape measure again. So that's the appeal side. The credit program is I have or am installing some stormwater management on my property that's going to reduce the contribution of my impervious surface to the general runoff that our MS4 has to deal with. It's a very simplified program for residential, mostly rain barrels. Most of what we do on the residential side is rain barrels, actually. But for commercial property, you might have subsurface detention basin or, really complex stormwater detention system. Then it's a more complex program, and third-party engineers almost always put together the credit application and submit it on behalf of commercial clients. All properties are reassessed based whenever a property changes hands, even if it's interfamily, someone inheriting a property or like a divorce. Anytime there's a change to the deed at the property, it triggers a reassessment from us, just to make sure that it's billed accurately. Either and it often results in a bill being reduced. I mean, we do it to increase the bill and also to decrease the bill. We just want it to be accurate and fair. Anytime a building permit is pulled, that will trigger a reassessment as well, regardless of whether or not the building going on the property actually results in an increase or decrease in impervious surface. It's just something that, every few years, it's hard to imagine a property going more than, say, 10 years without a building permit of any kind. So it's just something that happens routinely, and we get maybe 2 or 3 dozen a month, and we can just quickly use that as an objective way to make sure that we're checking in from time to time and billing fairly. And we created a fee, not a tax. And again, that goes back to the 1/3 of properties in the borough that don't pay any taxes, but as you can imagine, especially with our student population, put an enormous strain on municipal services such as solid waste management, police. These non-taxable properties demand a lot of our municipality. So we wanted to make a program that at least one thing that is fair and transparent and equitable to the problem being created, regardless of the tax status of the property. That was our approach, why we went the fee route. So eligible program costs by ordinance, all revenue generated by the fund it's a completely separate fund, and it's only usable for stormwater management things. On the right here is the text from the ordinance. On the left is sort of a translation of the ordinance into terms we're probably all more familiar with. But suffice to say, if it's about stormwater, it can be covered by this. If it's not stormwater related, we're not spending any of this money on it. Here's a look at our budget. We generate just over $1.1 million in revenue annually. Staffing wise, about 7 or 8% of that goes to managing the program. Not only the revenue side, but also the fun part, the spending the money, our in-house stormwater management responsibilities, interfacing with our consultants and project management on our capital projects. Administrative costs to actually administering the revenue side of the program are about 1%. I'm very proud of that. We have an unfortunately large legal budget, which I'll get into a little later. Professional fees, consulting, things like that, about $85,000. We do street tree planning because street trees offer, because they're planted over impervious surface, they offer stormwater benefits. So we do street tree planning. About $200,000 a year goes to maintaining our existing system and all the elements. There's about $100,000 from a bond that we took out prior to the stream protection fee being in place to do a number of projects. Before we had dedicated funding, we used bond revenue to do that. And now we're using stream protection fee dollars to pay back the piece of that bond that was spent on stormwater management. And then that leaves about $500,000 a year, about half of our revenue, for new stormwater infrastructure. Basically, we do maybe 2 or 3 small BMP projects every year, or we try to do one big project in a calendar year. Although if you've worked on these projects, you know the challenge in, I mean, it's completely impossible to do preliminary design, apply for grants, put a project out to bid, and do construction management, even in a small project, in one calendar year. So in reality, there's some projects in design, there's some projects in execution phase in any given year. But again, this is just an overview of how we're spending the money. And here's some examples of projects we've done. This is one of we have, I think, 16 or 18 rain gardens now. This is an example of one of the better looking ones. They don't all look this great. They are not low maintenance projects, but here's one example of them. This is a alleyway. Can't really see, but to the right of the alley is a unnamed tributary of a very small stream. It's almost dry on a day like today, but during the rain, it could get to ripping pretty well. So this is alley and permeable pavers and some other underground stormwater infrastructure to help ease the runoff from the homes and the driveways to the left into the alley, and from the alley into that stream. And this is a example of what is called an armoring project. Really severe erosion here, and a huge source of sediment into this creek. This is a Plum Run in the southwest of town. This is before you can see that we're about to lose someone's garage into the stream. And then this is what it looks like afterwards during a pretty heavy precipitation event. We have lots of projects like this to do. They always bug me because we don't get any credit with Pennsylvania DEP for this type of project because it's not considered green stormwater infrastructure. Even though now that it's done, there'll be a lot less sediment getting into the creek. Because of this section, it's, I guess, considered old school thinking. And so we don't get credit to our DEP goals for this type of project, but as you can see, very clearly they're necessary to do. So some challenges that have come along with our program, I'm very candid about these. Litigation, we've been sued by Westchester University over whether or not our stormwater fee is a fee or a tax. It's been in the news recently because the court has recently ruled against it and declared that our fee is in reality a tax. We have that's not the end of the legal battle. It's, they've won the battle, not the war. The frustrating part about this is we have basically the whole Commonwealth behind the university. It's a state university. And we feel that little Westchester Borough is fighting this fight for all municipalities across the state. So it's been a financial burden for us and really chewed into not only the revenue, about 10% of what we thought we were going to bring in with this program, we're not collecting because of the university. And then we have another 5% going out on legal fees. So suffice to say about 15% of where every year is just churned up in this legal battle. And it's very unfortunate. So I think, like I said, it's not over, but it probably maybe another year or two will go to the state Supreme Court, and we'll see where we are. But I think this has a potential to, obviously be a precedent statewide and possibly even in other states. So we're out there fighting the good fight on behalf of every municipality in the country. Inflation too has been a huge problem just the last 2 years. Our cost estimates, again, I said that the planning for this really started in 2013. That's when the rate was set. We're not getting half of what we were getting in 2013. So it begs the question of not if, but when we'll have to adjust the rate, which, just like a tax increase is not going to be popular with our residents. There's definitely competing priorities for funding. I mean, going back to our projects, we want to do stuff like this. People like this. It helps with flooding in our borough. If we're able to do a ton of these projects over decades, it'll really help with flooding in the borough. But we find ourselves doing a lot of projects like this, which again are are really necessary, but may only really benefit a handful of property owners, and they're not getting us credit with DEP that we very desperately need. Public expectations, Amanda mentioned this, but I can't tell you how many times I get calls that say, well, I've been paying this for 6 years and you haven't addressed the pet issue in my backyard. What are you doing over there? So there's very much an expectation with a fee in place, you're going to solve every problem overnight. And that's something we have to constantly educate. Here's what we are doing. There's a priority list. Here's how we choose our priorities. And it's really helpful to have third-party, super sharp engineers working on that rather than it being perceived as just, priorities of borough staff. Maintenance is a big thing too. Every dollar we spend on capital commits us to a fraction of a dollar on maintenance. BMPs have all different ranges of maintenance needs, but none of them are zero maintenance. So the way I look at it, again, every dollar we spend on capital is, a piece of a dollar in the future that we have to spend every single year on maintenance. So assuming there's no change to revenue, that pie chart I showed that had about half the money being spent on capital and maybe a quarter being spent on maintenance, that's going to shift towards maintenance over time unless we find an infusion of capital. And where grants are the answer there, at least in the short to midterm. We're working hard every single project we put in the ground. We're giving ourselves multiple opportunities to get grant funds so that we do not need to raise the rate on residents. But again, it's only a matter of time before that needs to be done. And lastly, a regulatory compliance. Like all municipalities, we're dealing with an avalanche of regulation coming down from DEP. As a advocate for sustainability, I'm passionate about sustainability. I love the thinking that goes into these regulations, but not necessarily the way they're being implemented. We spent maybe $20,000 in engineering and legal fees just revising our stormwater ordinance this year because we were required by law to do that. Every few years, there's something like that. And I'm glad we have a stream protection fee to pay for those things. But it's every dollar we spend on a lawyer is a dollar we can't spend actually addressing stormwater quality. So that's also been a challenge. So that's all I have to say. Happy to take questions or pass along to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Will. So at this time, I'm going to open it up to questions. We'll start with Amanda to give you, Will, a moment to take a sip of water or breathe. So I'm going to start with using some of the questions. And Amanda, I don't know if you took a look at some of those questions and you want to get started. But feel free. So Amanda will answer some of the questions that you've shared in the chat box, but feel free to raise your hand or take yourself off mute to ask a question.
Thanks, Lee. So I'll start with some of the questions that came in when I was talking. One of them was, can the clean water SRF funding for all states be used for match? And as far as I know, I believe that is the case, is that it is eligible for match for different programs, even though it was federal based. But again, look carefully at the requirements of each program, because usually it does say, depending on what you're applying for. And then along with that question, it said, do you know of any good examples of this in Pennsylvania where clean water SRF was used for match with additional funds to implement natural stormwater infrastructure solutions? So I don't have any specific examples of that, but I will touch base with some of my colleagues here and see if I can provide that and follow up with that afterwards. Another question was, is a disadvantaged community the same as an overburdened community? And how do you find out if your municipality is a disadvantaged community? And so New Jersey does use the phrase overburdened community, and they do have mapping on their website. You might hear the term environmental justice community, or, there's a lot of different ways that is categorized. I believe, the federal government calls it disadvantaged communities, but then each state can have it be slightly different. So if you look at New Jersey DEP's website, and I could put the link in the chat, there is a map that shows each municipality and their overburdened community rating. So the next question was if projects can be eligible to be awarded with Green Project Reserve funds through SRF. Hoping to learn more about this in Pennsylvania, but it's proven difficult. Is it just included within the state clean water SRF? So there is a Green Project Reserve Fund that is through the Clean Water SRF, and that was established through EPA and the federal government back in 2009 with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. So if you recall, the ARA funds, ARA, set up the Green Project Reserve, and there is very specific requirements for what can be applied for as a green project, and most stormwater projects and green infrastructure do apply. So to my knowledge, this is an SRF program when you say Green Project Reserve. So yes, that would be through your Clean Water SRF, and that does still exist. There are also green projects through drinking water as well, but you know, again, most stormwater green projects do apply, but there is a full list that EPA puts out with their recommendations. Okay, and I think in the chat, we're starting to then get into Will's questions.
Yeah, before we move on to some of those questions, does anyone else want to ask a question of Amanda? All right, I'll let you keep thinking about that. So turning it over to some of these questions that came in during Will's presentation. One is from Regina. Can you give a range of the fee amounts typical for residential properties? The percent increase seems high.
Yeah, so good question, and I should have expanded on that. So we have that rate, $6.70 per 1,000 square feet per month. For smaller properties, we grouped everyone into 5 tiers just to make things simpler. They are roughly proportionate. Again, I think rather than have everything be perfectly proportionate, they made some compromises to make it simpler to administer and understand for residents. The average household bill is probably about $141 per year. But that being said, you know, your small, like 2-bedroom row home downtown is probably $40 a year. And then we have homes that pay $1,000 a year because they are 8 bedrooms on 3 acres with a pool and a 3-car garage and all that. So the spread between rates is like literally a factor of 20 or 25 just in residential. But suffice to say, 80% of homes, maybe 90% of homes are paying less than $200 a year.
The next question is from Jeff. Could you explain the delta between the $1.4 million program objective and the $1.16 million budget?
Yeah, in descending order of scale, first is the university not paying their bills, which when the program was created, we assumed that they would. So overall, we bill out 1.4 every year. The university is about 140,000, which they don't pay every year. On top of that, we've been spending about 60 grand on late fees per year on average. And then lastly is just overall collections rate. We collect about, outside of the university, we collect about 95% of what we bill out every year. And then sort of best budgeting practice, you budget revenue a little low. And that way you never have to go in front of an elected board and tell them why you're running a deficit in any given calendar year. But yeah, it mostly comes down to the university, and we don't collect 100% of what we bill out. We basically, if you get to be a year past due, then the fee is referred to a collections agency. We write it off our books, hand it over to collections, and the property will eventually be liened if the non-payment stretches into like 2 or 3 years.
Oh, you saw the follow-up question?
Yeah. Did you have meetings with university in advance of the rollout? I don't know. I wasn't there for that. I didn't work here at the time. I get the sense that it's not so much the Westchester University folks that are fighting back. I mean, I mentioned Goose Creek being our problem stream in the borough. It's mostly student neighborhood. I mean, it's the Goose Creek really impacts their community. I think it's more of a top down from the state. And we're technically being sued not by the university, but by the Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education. So I think, and what they're really worried about is not universities elsewhere in the state, but actually PennDOT is the real concern. If every municipality was to implement a stormwater utility and we don't include roads in our billing, but if we did, imagine the potential for potential financial impact if, say, the Pennsylvania Turnpike had to pay stormwater fee in every municipality that it passed through. That would be chaos. So I think the state, it's even higher than the Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education. They are sort of wary of losing tax exempt status if we find a clever way to implement a stormwater fee. I think that's what this is really about. But you have to love, and again, I love the sustainability aspects of what they're trying to implement, but we have the state telling us you need to clean up your streams. And then when we try to create a revenue stream to do so, we have the state sue us. And guess who decides who's right and who's wrong? The state. So you have to love the symmetry there. The other question I see is the maintenance responsibility for the rain garden. So we're responsible for that. We currently outsource it. In the past, it's been a landscaping company. This year we hired, it's all a public bid, but we got the bid to the right folks, I guess, this year. We are hiring a ecological restoration and native plant nursery to do the rain garden maintenance instead of, Joe Schmo landscaping company. And we're very excited about, just having some forward thinking folks doing that. We also launched a Adopt a Rain Garden program because we know a lot of the rain gardens are adjacent to private property, like residential property. We know people have an interest in what they look like, and we know people are already working in them and treating them as their own gardens. So what we wanted to do is sort of formalize a program, give them some really basic training, have them sign a liability waiver in case they're injured doing something like that, and just sort of formalize the relationship. And that way we know who's doing what and that they understand what they're doing and they understand the green stormwater aspects, that it's not just a garden. And excited to see how that program turns out, but we're just still recruiting volunteers for the coming growing season.
That sounds excellent. I'd love to hear how that pans out, the Adopt a Rain Garden program. Are there any other questions online?
Had a quick question for Will. For the rain barrels where private property owners can get credit, do they need to show that they're using the water, or do you need to lay eyes on the rain barrel year after year to make sure it's still there? Or
yeah, good question. So all credits have to be reapplied for every 3 years. And those we actually do site inspections on them. The rain barrel has to be installed on an existing downspout. It has to lead to a vegetated area or garden. And the homeowner has to sign a super, super basic maintenance agreement that says, amongst other things, that they'll empty it between precipitation events. Because what we don't want people doing is sort of gaming the system, installing rain barrels. Rain barrel fills up and then never does anything ever again. But I think, honestly, the credit program hasn't been that widely embraced. And I get the sense from working with homeowners that I have worked with that the people doing that they'd be doing it anyway. And they're really into, environmental things and the sustainability aspects of it. And the credit that they get towards their bill is just sort of the icing on the cake. So I don't think we have, non-functioning BMPs that we're giving credit for. The bigger concern is on the commercial side. If someone has like an underground stormwater basin that's been paved over and is now a parking lot when it was developed, and an engineer hasn't laid eyes on it or inspected it for 15 years, that's when we could potentially be giving money away for something that's not creating better stormwater outcomes for us. So luckily our new ordinance says there's a minimum maintenance schedule, and then even after really heavy precipitation events like a direct hit hurricane, they're supposed to be inspected. So the only thing where staff is inspecting is the residential stuff, and we do that every 3 years at a minimum. The name of the company we hired for maintenance, it's Arcawild. I'll type it in too. So not endorsing them at all, just saying it's a different approach to the standard landscaping contractors we've used in the past.
So I'm going to ask Will and Amanda, do either of you have a question you'd like to pose to the audience?
I'd be curious, from the poll, I think about 45% of people were from municipalities. I'd be curious of that group of folks from municipalities, how many have a stormwater fee in place, how many are thinking about it, and how many haven't thought about it?
Does anyone want to share? We have a response in the chat box. Don says that Jersey City doesn't have one in place. It's been an uphill battle. Okay. Radnor has a fee. Okay. Anyone else want to share? Now, working with some municipalities in New Jersey, but we still don't have the first one adopted. We also have an authority that enacted a stormwater fee 2 months ago and have paused it until the Westchester litigation is concluded. Okay.
Jeff, where are you from?
Upper Marion in Monaco.
Gotcha.
Regina, you want to chime in?
Yeah, I just would say that the fee was fairly nominal for residential. It was more, it was tiered differently for commercial in our municipality, and I think that was helpful. And I think it was also, we took the path where we did not tie directly to impervious cover, because we wanted to make the point that everyone uses the roads that are impervious. It's not just your property that contributes runoff. It's the town, it's the roads, it's, the schools and all the other things. So I think that was a helpful approach in opening people's minds to the need for this fee in the first place, because there's all of this facility going on that doesn't have a, you know, a dedicated funding source. And then also with all the new requirements that are now in place for the state in Pennsylvania, that there had to be a way to fund the projects that are mandated. There's no getting around those reductions in sediment loads. So I think the timing aligned well with those requirements, and it was very beneficial.
Okay, thanks for sharing. We also have a question from Rob. Can anyone give me an idea as to how difficult it is to get DEP permitting for installing floating wetland islands on a lake? So to improve water quality of the lake. I think a lot of folks can respond in the chat box to that question. Also, we have from Bianca, the pushback that I hear in my municipality, so that's Westfield, New Jersey, is that it doesn't make sense for us because we don't have any large institution or commercial, but mostly residential. That's interesting. How would you respond to that? Well,
I don't really see the relevancy to what type of property or even how big the property is. You know, it's for us, it was what's the scale of the contribution to the problem? You know, it doesn't matter if it's 10 houses or one commercial property that have the same impervious. Let's try to come up with something proportional to the impact. I think the overall theme in the recent ruling against us in the litigation was that they kept saying discrete benefit, and the view of the judges was that the revenue and work completed with the revenue benefits everyone across the board. And that not every single property derives a direct benefit to their property. If you say, well, yeah, but you know, these certain streets don't flood anymore, and that it's helpful. It's nice when streets in your town don't flood. That's a I don't know, indiscrete benefit. That is what taxes are for. So I don't know, getting back to the question. Yeah, I don't know that like the existence of institutions or tax exempt or whatever really plays a bearing. You know, it's, hey, as a MS4, we have this many gallons of water to run to discharge and work with and clean according to DEP math. And you know, we need to, every single house, unless they're working the credit program and they don't have a bill, is contributing to this stormwater project. So let's all pay for it in proportion to your contribution. But that's the way we see it. That doesn't mean it's right or wrong. And according to these 7 judges, it's definitely not right.
any other questions on the line? So while folks are thinking of any additional questions, I'm going to launch the quiz. So you can go ahead and check your knowledge. So you can take that at your own pace. And again, if you want a CEU or PDH certificate from this training, this quiz is a mandatory component. If you aren't looking for a certificate and just want to know how well you can answer these questions, then go right ahead. And so while folks are taking that quiz, take few moments to also allow you to think about any other questions you might have for our presenters. And then I will go through some closing slides. Well, this is a good sign. I can say of the 5 people who've submitted quiz so far, we've got 100% correct. So go you. All right, so I'll give you some time to continue to think through questions and also take that quiz. But while you're doing that, I'm also going to share a few things. One, I wanted to remind you that there's going to be a drop-in office hour on Thursday. So if you process the information you learned, go back and look at some of the funding opportunities you're working on right now. And if any questions come up and you want to bring them to Amanda or Will, then drop in on Thursday, 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and they'll be available to answer those questions. Also, as a follow-up, it would be really helpful if you take our feedback survey. We've gotten a lot of great feedback so far about the type of training topics you'd be looking for in the future. The center has a lot of expertise and we've been doing this for a long time, but it just comes down to what do you need and what type of gaps in your training are you looking to fill through, what we can offer. We were lucky to get foundational support from the William Penn Foundation to offer this training for free. We also do offer some curated trainings for municipalities. So if you want a specific training where someone from the center will come out and do a training for you based on what you're looking for, we can develop a training that way as well. The training, I'm gonna grab the feedback survey so I can put that in the chat. So if you have a chance to take that feedback survey, I put the link in the chat. I'll also send out a follow-up email and you'll have the link that way as well. So again, we really appreciate that feedback. Also, check out the resource sheet. So this is a list of resources curated by the presenters today on funding programs, specific funding sources, specifically for the Delaware River watershed. You can also learn more about Will's Westchester, Chester County, Pennsylvania stream protection fee. So that's more about what Will presented on, and also P3 financing and municipal bonds. So if you are looking for additional resources, you can check that out. Or just email the presenters. That's another option. Also, for those who missed previous trainings, the link that I share in that thank you email that has access to, if those who have been in our previous trainings, access to slides and resource sheets, you actually have access to the slides and resource sheets from previous trainings as well. So if you want to check out those previous trainings, you can check out those resources, or they will be available on our YouTube channel. So if you just go to YouTube and search Center for Watershed, you will find our channel, and in about a week and a half, you will be able to see those videos. And again, through the feedback, I've taken a look at some of the topics that you are interested in learning more about. And we happen to have some webcasts coming up this year that actually touch on some of those topics. So I wanted to share our webcast series for 2023. You can contact our Director of Membership and Training, that's Karen Titus. Her information is on the right side there. If you are interested in the webcast series, you can either purchase individual webcasts, or you can join as a CWPA member and get either free or discounted rates for these webcasts. So I wanted to share these topics. You can also take a look at our website. They're all listed there as well. And I did mention CWPA membership. A couple things beyond our training opportunities, our discounted rates on our conferences. And then also we have an online watershed library with 2,000 plus resources on stormwater and watershed management. So that is a library that's been created by our staff on helpful tools and resources that have helped us to do our work for the last 30 years. And so if you would like to take a look at that online watershed library, become a member, we'd love to share it with you. Also, all of our publications are available on that library, and you don't need to be a member to access those publications. And again, there's also professional networking opportunities beyond our training and our conference. We also have happy hours. So if you want to meet our staff, we're a fun bunch, and we travel throughout the watershed and do some happy hours. I think we're picking up a little bit more after COVID now. We try to rotate because we're a national nonprofit. So if we're ever in the region, especially if there's a conference or something going on, we'll try to host a happy hour for our members in the area. So I'm going to see, this last slide has Amanda's contact information on it. But if you, Don, I'm happy to be in for a happy hour. If you have any questions, I really would recommend coming to that office hour on Thursday. So do we have any other questions? We have about 10 minutes left in the training. So I want to make sure we all have an opportunity to ask Amanda and Will anything that you're working on, or Amanda and Will, if you have a question for the audience, feel free to ask away. Also, the results for the quiz are now up. All right, if we don't have any other questions, then I guess we'll have 10 minutes back in our day. Very exciting when that happens. All right, so thank you everyone. And please check out our other trainings on YouTube. And again, if you have any questions about membership or other training opportunities, feel free to reach out to me at any time. I'll put my contact information in the chat.
Thanks, everyone.
Hey, thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.